Story number 1. The Whispers Beneath Wrangle. If there's one thing I've learned from all my years of research, it's that there are some things beneath the Earth's surface that were never meant to be uncovered. I should have trusted my instincts, but like all of us who chase knowledge, I ignored the signs. The deeper we went, the more we understood, and the more we wished we didn't. Let me start at the beginning, where everything seemed normal. The Mount Wrangle research station wasn't much to look at. It was built in the shadow of the mountain, a crumbling outpost of concrete and steel, tucked away near the volcanic region of Alaska's Wrangle Mountains. The only thing remarkable about it was the constant rumble of the earth. But that was expected. The area was known for its seismic activity, with volcanic tremors that shook the ground from time to time. We were here to study the tectonic shifts beneath us and monitor any signs of eruption. First, it seemed like any other research trip. The team was made up of 4 of us, me, a geophysicist named Dr. Roland Briggs, and 2 younger colleagues, Emily and Josh. We had all been to various seismic zones before. Earthquakes, eruptions, and tremors were a part of the job. But what we encountered here wasn't like anything I had ever experienced. It started with a hum, faint but persistent. It was subtle at first, barely audible, like the low hum of a refrigerator in a room full of silence. But there was something off about it. It wasn't a noise we could identify, not machinery, not wind, not even the usual tremors from Mount Wrangle's restless depths. The sound came from deep beneath the earth, from a place far below our reach. The first time we heard it clearly was on the 3rd night of our stay. Emily had just finished running a series of seismic tests on the northern ridge and had set up the equipment to monitor any potential volcanic activity. We were all sitting around the small table, discussing the day's data, when the noise began. At first, we thought it was a fault line slipping. It was low frequency, like a distant earthquake. But then it changed. It morphed into something else, something rhythmic, almost deliberate. It sounded like a heartbeat, slow but deliberate, pulsing through the ground. Josh, who had been sitting closest to the equipment, jumped up from his chair. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his face pale. His hand was trembling as he pointed toward the monitors. "That's not normal." I grabbed the closest headset and listened. The rhythm was unmistakable now, deep, guttural, like a slow breath drawn from the belly of the earth itself. The longer I listened, the more I felt something wrong, felt alive, felt aware. "Just tectonic stress," I said, but I wasn't convincing myself, let alone anyone else. The next day, we ran tests, recalibrated the sensors, and monitored the equipment carefully. Nothing had changed. The sound persisted, growing louder and more pronounced with each passing hour. It was like the earth itself was breathing, its lungs expanding and contracting beneath our feet. But then, it wasn't just the sound. Something else happened. I noticed Emily's face had gone ashen when I passed her in the hallway that evening. Her eyes were wide, fixed on something beyond me. I followed her gaze and saw nothing. "I hear it too," she whispered, her voice shaky. "Hear what?" I asked, but I already knew. "The calls," she said. "There are voices from the ground. It's like people calling to us." That night, I stayed up late, listening to the hum. It wasn't just a hum anymore. I could hear it, almost like words, low, guttural murmurs rising and falling in a strange cadence, like a voice from an ancient, forgotten place. That was when Dr. Briggs became truly worried. He had been skeptical at first, brushing off the sounds as natural phenomena. But now, even he couldn't ignore the growing fear in the air. The sound, whatever it was getting stronger. It was almost as if it were calling us, pulling us toward something deep in the earth's bowels. The next morning, he gathered us all in the main station room. "I've been researching this all night," he said, his voice tense. "There are legends of earth whispers, ancient stories passed down through indigenous cultures. Some of them speak of things buried beneath the land, old gods, old spirits, trapped in the deep. They say when the earth is restless, the voices can be heard, but they're never meant to be listened to. The look on his face sent a chill through me. Dr. Briggs had always been rational, always a scientist to the core. To see him so shaken was something I had never imagined. "Do you think it's possible?" I asked. "I don't know," he replied, his voice faltering. "But I'm afraid we may be hearing something we shouldn't." We decided to leave, but when we tried, something had changed. The roads were blocked by sudden, fierce snowstorms, and the snowdrifts piled up too quickly for us to dig out. The radio equipment was dead. The satellite signals jammed. We were trapped. As the days passed, the noises intensified. They weren't just whispers anymore. The rhythm had grown faster, like a heart frantically pounding, like something desperate to escape. It felt like the earth was closing in on us, suffocating us with its breath. On the fifth night, something happened. We were all in the main room when we heard it, louder than ever before. The ground beneath us shook with a violent tremor, followed by a sound that was no longer rhythmic. It was a scream, a howl, primal and full of rage, and it came from deep beneath the earth. Emily screamed, her voice barely audible over the deafening roar. "It's awake," she gasped. "It's awake." In a panic, we grabbed our things and rushed to the exit. But the snowstorm had worsened. The wind howled like a beast, forcing us back toward the station. We tried to huddle together, hoping the storm would subside. But it didn't, and the sound never stopped. It only grew louder. Then, it was gone. Just like that, the storm stopped. The wind died down. The ground went still. But the silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise. It was a silence that weighed on us, pressing down like the heavy breath of something that had been waiting, watching. We don't speak of it much. Emily left the project shortly after, claiming she couldn't handle the pressure anymore. Josh went into isolation for weeks, refusing to talk about what he'd heard. Dr. Briggs? He was never the same. He became obsessed with finding answers. But every time he tried to return to the station, something stopped him, some invisible force. As for me, I can't forget the sound, the rhythm, the feeling that something was watching, waiting, deep within the earth. And sometimes, when I lie in bed late at night, I can hear it again, the breath, the call, and I wonder, what if it's still waiting for us? Story number 2. The Abyss of Illusion, the Sea Monster's Curse. It all started with the waves. I should have known, right then, that there was something wrong. But, like everyone else who's ever been blinded by curiosity, I pushed on. We all did. I mean, who wouldn't want to be part of a secret research mission in the Aleutian Islands? An uncharted world of mist and salt water, where the air felt so fresh it almost burned your lungs. A world where, if you dared to listen closely, you could hear the deep, ancient hum of the ocean, almost as though it were alive. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The Aleutian Research Station wasn't much to look at. A series of metal barracks wedged between jagged cliffs and the turbulent ocean, with nothing but miles of ice and rock between us and the edge of the world. But that was the point. No distractions, no outside interference. Just us, our research, and the vast, unknown depths of the sea. We were there for one reason, to study marine life. But what we found, what we brought back with us, was far from anything the scientific community or humanity could ever prepare for. It was a late afternoon when we discovered it. Michael, a marine biologist who'd been with the project since its inception, was the first to notice something strange. He'd been diving off the coast, going deeper into the water than we had ever dared. And when he came back to the surface, his eyes were wide, his breath ragged, as if he had seen something that had torn through the very fabric of reality. "Get the others," he said, but his voice was barely a whisper. "There's something out there, something different." We were used to Michael's exaggerations, but not this time. He didn't look like a man who had just seen a new species of fish. His skin was pale, his fingers trembling. His eyes darted from one of us to the next, as if expecting something to reach out from the dark. After a tense silence, we all gathered on the dock, where Michael handed us the evidence. It was a creature, a thing from the depths that should not exist. Half fish, half whatever the hell it was, with translucent skin that shimmered in the low light, revealing organs that moved in ways that defied biology. The thing was nearly 4 feet long, his body an abomination of fins, tentacles, and features that didn't belong together. It's not from this world, Michael whispered, and somehow, even though I couldn't explain why, I believed him. We took the creature back to the station, eager to examine it further. The first night, things seemed normal enough. We set up the research tanks, preserved the specimen in saline, and began to document it. But the moment we began studying it, really studying it, was when the strange occurrences began. First, it was subtle. The equipment malfunctioned randomly, unpredictably. The temperature gauges went haywire. Lights flickered, even though the power grid was stable. But then, it escalated. Doors slammed shut on their own. Objects were moved from one place to another. In the dead of night, we'd hear footsteps, shuffling. Slow footsteps, coming from the hallway outside the lab. But when we opened the door, no one was there. And then there were the dreams. I don't know if it was the isolation, the stress, or something far more sinister, but we all began to have the same nightmares. They were always the same. We'd find ourselves at the bottom of the ocean, surrounded by darkness. And then, we'd hear it. The voice. A voice that wasn't human, but not entirely alien either. It was a whisper, a constant hum that echoed in our skulls, reverberating through our bodies, telling us that it knew we had disturbed its resting place. The worst part? We could feel it watching us. First, we thought it was just exhaustion, the result of too many sleepless nights. But the dreams didn't stop. They grew more vivid, more real. The voice wasn't just in our heads. It was in our hearts. We felt it in our chests, like something was pulling us down, deeper and deeper into the cold black waters. Michael was the first to crack. He started talking to himself, muttering in a language none of us understood. He wouldn't sleep. He wouldn't eat. He just stared at the specimen, his eyes hollow, as though it had somehow claimed him. We tried to help him, but it was too late. By the time we realized he had gone mad, it was already too late to stop what was happening. I remember the night he disappeared. The wind howled outside, the blizzards having picked up again. It was the perfect storm. One of those unholy nights where the sky is black as pitch, and the only light comes from the glow of the station's emergency lights. We were gathered around the table, trying to make sense of the madness, when we heard it. A sound, low, guttural, like something dragging its body across the floor. We rushed to the lab. The door was wide open. Inside, the tank holding the creature was cracked. The water was rippling, and Michael, he was gone. There were only his bloody footprints, leading into the darkness, into the deep, endless night. For days, we searched, but there was no sign of him. Nothing, just the eerie hum of the creature's tank, like it was calling us, whispering our names. The nightmares didn't stop. The creature, I'm convinced, was calling to us. It had woken something ancient, and now it wanted more. One by one, the rest of the team began to disappear. They'd wake up in the middle of the night, hear the voice calling to them, and wander off into the blizzard, never to be seen again. And every morning, I found myself alone in the station, more terrified than the last. Then there was the night I saw it. The creature, the thing we had dragged out of the sea, was gone. Not just physically. It had disappeared. But somehow, it had left a part of itself behind. I don't know how to explain it, but it was like the air around me had thickened, like the entire station was alive, aware. And from the shadows, something moved, something too large, too twisted, to belong in our world. I don't know how long I've been here, in this forsaken place. I can't remember when the others left. or even when they died. Time, in the Aleutian Islands, seems to stretch and twist the way the ocean does, bending reality itself. Maybe I'm already gone. Maybe, like the rest of the team, I've already been claimed by the creature. Maybe I'll hear its voice calling to me again soon, pulling me into the depths. I don't know. But I do know one thing. If you ever find yourself on the Aleutian Islands, don't go near the water. Don't disturb the depths, because something old, something powerful, something beyond comprehension lurks down there, and it will call to you, and once it does, you'll never be able to stop hearing its whispers. Story number 3. The disappearance of the secret research team. It started like any other routine expedition. The year was 1970, and I was part of the team at a research station high in the Alaskan wilderness. We were far from civilization, far from the noise of the world, and that was the way we liked it. Up here, in the dead of winter, the snow swallowed every sound, every memory, and every trace of life that wasn't our own. We were a group of 10, and our mission was simple: gather data on the effects of extreme isolation and cold on human psychology. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it was work, and for some of us, it was an escape. We had come to study the land, but we ended up becoming part of the land itself, lost, unremembered. But that was before the lights. I wasn't the first to see them. It was Paul, one of the geologists, who had come back from a late-night survey near the ridge. He was white as a ghost, his lips trembling like he'd seen something far worse than the biting cold. "I saw them," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Saw what?" I had asked, not understanding the urgency in his eyes. He was too pale, his pupils wide as if he had been drugged. Lights, strange lights in the sky. They were moving, changing color. It wasn't like anything I've ever seen before. I thought nothing of it at the time. Just another hallucination brought on by isolation. Perhaps Paul had been working late, and the nights up here could get long and strange. But that night, when I stepped outside to take a breath of cold air, I saw them, too. The lights hovered above the horizon, like some cosmic firefly trapped in the thick, oppressive dark. It wasn't just the colors, they were alive, pulsating with an energy that made my skin crawl. I remember feeling a deep unease settle in my chest, a feeling I couldn't shake. It was like something was watching us, waiting for us to make the wrong move. The lights would come and go, dancing over the mountain ridges in a slow, deliberate pattern. We joked about it at first. Maybe it was the Russians testing something new. Maybe it was a weather anomaly. But I knew, deep down, I knew that it wasn't. Whatever it wasn't natural. It wasn't until 2 days later that the team began to notice changes. Subtle at first. People were restless, their minds clouded. Equipment malfunctioned for no reason at all. Instruments that had been working fine 1 minute would suddenly shut down the next. Sarah, our medic, said she was hearing things. Whispers in the vents. Soft, unintelligible murmurs that sounded like words. The air grew thicker. Every breath felt harder to take, like the weight of the atmosphere itself was pressing against us. I didn't know it then, but we were already becoming part of something bigger, a force we couldn't understand, something ancient and terrible that didn't belong on Earth. Then, the disappearances began. It was Karen, our communications specialist, who was the first to vanish. One moment, she was in the main room, sitting at her desk. The next, she was gone, just like that. No struggle, no sign of a break-in. Her chair was still pushed in under the desk, her coffee cup still steaming. We thought she was playing a prank at first, but when we searched the station, there was no sign of her, no footprints, no clues, just an empty room, her equipment left untouched. That was the first time we really felt the shift, the subtle but undeniable pull of fear. It wasn't just that she was gone. It was the silence that followed, the way the station seemed to close in on us, the way our hearts beat louder than ever, thumping against the stillness of the air. After Karen, things started to spiral. People stopped sleeping. We began to see things out of the corner of our eyes. Shapes in the shadows. Fleeting figures in the hallways. Sometimes, the lights would return, shimmering just outside the windows. They'd come closer, just out of reach, before vanishing without a trace. The second disappearance was Mark. He'd gone out for a routine check on the exterior equipment. We heard his radio crackle to life, then went silent. No one came back. We couldn't leave. We were trapped by the storm. We were miles away from any help. And the moment we tried to walk toward the radio tower, the winds picked up, pushing us back, as if something didn't want us to go. By the time the team finally found us, it was too late. The storm had cleared, but the damage had already been done. The research station, the so-called base of operations, was empty. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just the broken equipment, the wrecked files, and the fading echoes of whispers that never seemed to stop. But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst was what we found next. The rescue team reported strange anomalies. Too, they said they heard voices, distant and cold, on their radios, but there was no one around. They said the wind didn't blow in a straight line, that the snow had fallen in odd, unnatural patterns, as if the very landscape had been reshaped. The station, they said, had been abandoned long before they arrived. And as for the lights, they were gone. But not really. They were always there. Now, somewhere, out there in the distance, the faintest flicker on the horizon, like a beacon calling us back to something we couldn't outrun. The official reports say nothing about the strange lights, nothing about the disappearances, nothing about the whispers or the madness that gripped us. They say the team simply went missing, lost to the storm, and the rest is classified. But I know better. I'm the last one left, and every night, I still hear those whispers. I still see the lights. They never stop, not even when I close my eyes. Maybe someday, someone will come looking for us again. But I know, deep down, I won't be here to see them. Whatever it was that took us, whatever it was that swallowed my friends whole, it's waiting, still waiting, and it always will be. Story number 4. The experiment at McMurdo Station. I should have known better. I should have seen it coming. But I didn't. It was all so tempting. So easy to dismiss as just another one of those strange research projects we do up here in the frozen corners of the world. A psychological experiment. They called it. You know the type. The kind where they push you to your limits to see how much you can handle before your mind cracks. Like a thin sheet of ice breaking under too much weight. McMurdo Station, well, it wasn't exactly McMurdo in the classic sense. It was a small, isolated facility on the edge of the world, buried deep within the Alaskan wilderness. A secret, really. Just a handful of researchers and scientists. No tourists, no outsiders. We didn't even get much radio contact, unless we needed it. No distractions, just snow, ice, and a whole lot of nothing for miles. They called it the isolation protocol. There were 6 of us to start, 6 volunteers, each one of us eager to take part in the experiment. It sounded harmless enough, after all. It was just an experiment. Spend 3 months in complete isolation, with only the occasional contact from the outside world. No communication with family, no distractions, no internet. The idea was to see how long we could last before our minds began to break down. Pretty simple, right? But nothing up here is ever simple. I'm not sure when it started. Maybe it was the first night. I remember standing in the mess hall with Sarah. She was the psychologist running the study. Very neat, very composed. And she was asking me how I felt about being away from the world for so long. I told her I felt fine, but I didn't. I couldn't explain it. There was something heavy in the air, something oppressive, something that made the quiet feel too loud. It started as small things, nothing I could put my finger on at first. There were noises, voices, faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the wind doesn't speak to you, does it? And I swear, sometimes, I'd hear my name being called from the hallway. I'd get up to check. But there was no one there. That's when I started seeing things. The shadows in the corners of my vision. Figures moving just out of reach. But when I turned to face them, they were gone. First, it wasn't alarming. Maybe it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. But then it got worse. There was James. He was always the quiet one. But one morning, he didn't show up for breakfast. It was strange. James was punctual. Always early for every meal. We knocked on his door. But there was no answer. When we finally forced the door open, we found him sitting in the dark, staring at the wall. His eyes were wide, unblinking, as though he had been frozen in time. And he was muttering to himself, words that made no sense. Or maybe they did, but I couldn't understand them. Something about the Watchers and the ice is alive. Sarah tried to talk to him, but he wouldn't respond. He just stared into the empty space of the room, lost to something none of us could see. It was then that I realized something was wrong. Something far more wrong than any of us could have prepared for. The isolation, no matter how much we tried to convince ourselves it was just psychological, was having an effect. But it wasn't just on us. It was something else. Something outside. One night, as I sat in my quarters, trying to block out the growing sense of dread, I heard something, or rather, someone, the faintest whisper of a voice, not in my head, but in the room. It was so quiet I almost missed it. "Help me," it said, and then it laughed. It was a hollow laugh, like someone had been left alone in the cold for too long. I ran to the hallway, but again, no one was there, just the cold metal walls and the sound of my breathing. The others were starting to act strange too. Sarah, who had been our rock, started growing paranoid. She claimed she saw faces in the windows, faces that weren't there when she looked again. Some of the others were seeing the same things, but they didn't talk about it. Not openly. Instead, they kept it to themselves, like it was some secret they didn't want to share. But I could see it in their eyes, the same look I had. The look of someone who had seen something that wasn't supposed to be. And then there was the dream. The first time it happened, I thought it was just me. A bad dream. You know? The kind you can shrug off in the morning. But after that, couldn't shake it. Every night, the dream came back. Each time more vivid. More real. I was standing outside in the freezing cold, surrounded by nothing but snow and ice. But it wasn't the snow that scared me. It was the shape in the distance. A figure, slowly moving towards me. Tall, too tall, with long arms that seemed to stretch out of the shadows. And when it reached me, it whispered my name, and it felt like the very air around me turned to ice. Couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The thing took my arm and I felt myself being pulled into the darkness, into the cold. When I woke up, I was drenched in sweat, my heart racing. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that I wasn't alone. Standing at the foot of my bed, just staring at me, was Sarah, her eyes wide and unblinking, like James. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. I tried to scream, but my voice got lost in the suffocating silence of the station. By the time the rescue team arrived, it was too late. James was gone, and so was Sarah. They never found her. Not in the ice, not in the snow. And as for me, well, I barely remember how I made it out of there. All I know is that I've never been the same. The worst part? The voices, the whispers, they're still there. They followed me out of the station, and they're still with me now. I can hear them in the walls, in the air, no matter how far I run, no matter how many miles I put between me and that cursed place. They're always there. Waiting, watching, and now, I'm not sure who I'm more afraid of, the ones who were lost, or the ones who never left. Story number 5. The Ghosts of Bering Sea Station. It was the kind of night you can only find in the far reaches of the world, where the air is thick with salt and ice, and the sun dips below the horizon without so much as a whisper, leaving you with nothing but the endless black of night. The Bering Sea Station, perched on the edge of the icy expanse, wasn't a place for the faint of heart. No one came here for vacation, that's for sure. Scientists, engineers, a few brave souls who had nowhere else to go, all gathered together to study the tides, the winds, the shifting currents of one of the most desolate places on Earth. But it wasn't the weather that would haunt us. Not in the way you're thinking. It started innocuously enough. I wasn't the first one to notice the shadows. Know that honor went to Sarah, one of the junior engineers. She was a quiet sort, kept to herself, didn't talk much. But I noticed the way she watched the shadows cast by the flickering fluorescent lights in the hallway. It was something that didn't sit right with me. Not at first. It wasn't like she was afraid of them, but she was watching, always watching, like something was moving in the periphery of her vision, just out of reach. That night, I was on the late shift. The rest of the team had gone to bed, and the station was as silent as the sea outside. The kind of silence that presses down on you, makes it hard to breathe. It's the kind of silence that makes you wish for the sound of something, anything, just to break the tension in the air. But there was nothing, just the hum of the electrical systems, the occasional clink of a pipe settling under the pressure of the cold. I was sitting at my desk, trying to finish a report on the latest atmospheric readings, when I heard it. The first door creaked, just a faint sound, the kind of thing that could have been a draft, or maybe the building settling in the cold. But there was something about it, something wrong. I looked up, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, but there was no one there. The hallway was dark, as it always was after hours, the dim light from the single bulb in the kitchen casting long shadows on the floor. I should have just shrugged it off. After all, I'd been working out here for almost 6 months. Things creaked, things groaned. That was just part of living on a station like this. But that night felt different. I walked into the hallway, my boots clicking against the concrete floor. The building felt colder than usual, and I could see my breath in the air, even though the heat was running fine. As I moved past the kitchen, I saw Sarah again. She was standing at the end of the hallway, staring at something. "Sarah?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty hall. She didn't respond, but I could see her lips moving, like she was talking to someone or something. "Sarah?" I repeated, taking a step closer. She finally turned her head, and when she did, her face was pale, her eyes wide. "You didn't hear it, did you?" she asked, her voice shaky. "Hear what?" I asked, a chill creeping down my spine. "The footsteps," she whispered. "They're always there, walking around the station. But there's no one there." I laughed nervously, trying to brush it off. "It's probably just the wind or something. You know how old buildings are, right? They creak and moan all the time." But Sarah didn't seem convinced. Her eyes were still fixed on the end of the hallway, like someone was standing just out of sight. I glanced down the hallway, but there was nothing there. No shadows moving, no one waiting, just the dark, oppressive stillness of the station. "Maybe you should get some rest," I suggested. "I'll keep an eye out." She nodded, but before she turned to go back to her room, she hesitated. "I'm telling you," she said quietly, "they're here. I hear them walking around. Sometimes it's like they're right behind me." I didn't know what to say. What do you say to someone who's that frightened? But then it happened again. The sound. The door creaked. But this time, it wasn't just one door. It was several, all along the hallway, one after another. Creak, creak, creak. "Did you hear that?" I asked Sarah. But when I turned to look, she was already gone. Her door was closed, the light dim under the crack. I was alone again. At first, I thought it was the wind, or some weird sound that the old station made when the cold air hit it just right. But then it started to get worse. The creaking doors, the whispers, the sounds of footsteps in the hall. All of them began to happen at the same time, as though there were more people here than I could see. And then, the shadows. The first time I saw it, it was out of the corner of my eye, just a glimpse of something moving across the kitchen. I rushed in, But nothing was there. The second time, I wasn't so sure. I thought I saw something standing in the hallway, just outside the door to the lab. A shadow that didn't belong. A figure standing motionless in the darkness. But when I walked into the hallway, there was nothing, just the cold and the silence. The silence that felt too heavy. By the time the third time came, I wasn't sure what to think anymore. The shadows weren't just shadows anymore. They were figures. Human shapes that moved just out of sight. Always just out of reach. I saw them in the reflection of the window, standing in the snow, watching me, but when I turned around, they were gone. Always gone. Always just a flicker of movement. A trace of someone who shouldn't have been there. And the whispers, they were getting louder. I was beginning to lose track of time. The days blurred together, like everything was caught in some twisted cycle. It was like the station itself was alive, breathing in the dark. There were sounds from the walls, from the floors, from the ceilings. Then, one night, no, not a night, but an early morning when the wind was howling outside like a pack of wolves, I saw him, a man, standing by the door to the storage room, just standing there, looking at me. He was tall, his face pale and gaunt, his clothes ragged as if they'd been torn by something sharp. And when he turned his head to look at me, his eyes weren't human. They were black, endless pools of dark. And in them, I saw something. Something that didn't belong in the world. Before I could react, he vanished, disappeared into thin air, like the others. I didn't sleep after that. Couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see them, the figures, the shadows, the man with the black eyes. And I wasn't sure if I was awake or dreaming anymore. By the time the rescue team came to check on us, they found only the empty station. No one left, not a soul in sight. All the rooms were empty, all the doors locked. The equipment was intact, though damaged from the storm that had hit before we lost contact. But as they searched the station, the rescue team started hearing it too, the creaking doors, the footsteps in the hall, the whispers. The ghosts of the Bering Sea Station had finally found someone else to watch. And they would never stop. They never stop. Story number 6. The blizzard and the vanishing. It's hard to explain the things that happened up there in Alaska. Things you wouldn't believe unless you'd seen them with your own eyes. But I'm going to try. Maybe you'll understand. Maybe you won't. All I can tell you is, sometimes the world has a way of keeping its secrets. And sometimes, it doesn't want you to know them. It was winter, of course. A season that makes its presence felt in Alaska with every gust of wind. Every inch of snow, every creeping sense of isolation. People don't realize it. But Alaska isn't just cold. It's alive. It watches you, waits for you to slip up, to lose your way, to make that mistake. The cold doesn't kill you outright. No, it's the way it drains you. It makes you weaker, slower, more vulnerable, until the cold's claws get into your bones. And then it starts to work on your mind. I remember the day I arrived at the station. It wasn't my first time there. I had been part of the research crew before. But this time it was different. The team had been out there for a while, studying the effects of geomagnetic storms on the atmosphere, conducting some of the most secretive experiments known to science. But when I walked into the station that day, something was off. It wasn't just the cold. It was something deeper, something wrong. The blizzard had already set in by the time I arrived. A swirling mass of snow and ice that made visibility impossible past 10 feet. The kind of storm that feels alive, like it wants to swallow you whole. The wind howled like a banshee, a wailing cry that seemed to echo off the mountains, off the ice fields. I had been briefed over the radio, told the team was fine, that there was nothing to worry about. But when I stepped into that station, I knew something was wrong. The doors had been blown open. The snow had drifted in, covering the floors like a thick, suffocating blanket. Equipment was scattered everywhere, papers, charts, and tools tossed around like someone had been searching for something. A few chairs were knocked over, and the fire, once blazing in the hearth, was reduced to a faint smolder. But the worst part? The place was silent. There was no sign of anyone. The comms equipment was destroyed, shredded into pieces as if something had tried to tear through it with a force far beyond anything the storm could have caused. I made my way through the station, my boots crunching against the ice and snow. It wasn't long before I found the first sign of trouble. A bloodstain, just a small splatter, nothing too big, but enough to make my stomach tighten. I followed the trail down the corridor, my pulse quickening with each step. And that's when I found the door. It was one of the storage rooms. The door had been ripped off its hinges, as though something had torn it open. Inside, there was nothing, just a few scattered tools and equipment. Nothing out of the ordinary, but on the floor, near the far corner, was a strange shape, a dark, inky shadow in the snow. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I moved closer, I could make out the details. It was a footprint, a human footprint, but distorted, wrong. It was larger than any human foot I'd ever seen. The edges blurred as if the snow had melted and refroze. But it wasn't the size that bothered me, it was the way it seemed to shift. Like the print wasn't solid. Like it was fading in and out of reality. I backed away slowly, my hand instinctively reaching for the radio. I needed to contact the team, but the static was deafening. The comms were dead. I stepped back into the main room, my breath coming faster now. That's when I heard it. A sound, soft at first, like a whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind. But no, it was something different. The sound grew louder, more distinct. The whisper was followed by a low, groaning noise, as if something was struggling to breathe. And then I heard it, a voice, faint, but unmistakable. It wasn't speaking to me, not directly, but I could hear it clear as day. The voice was desperate, a cry for help, or maybe more like a warning. It was hard to tell. Get out, before it gets you too. I froze. My heart was pounding in my chest. I wanted to turn, to run, but I couldn't. It wasn't just fear anymore, it was the pull, the weight of the voice. It felt like it was coming from all directions, as if the walls themselves were speaking. I glanced around, trying to see who or what was making the noise, but the room remained empty. That's when I saw them. The shadows. They were faint at first, just fleeting shapes in the corner of my vision. But as I blinked, they grew clearer. Human forms, but wrong, twisted and stretched in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Figures that seemed to float, disjointed, their outlines shimmering like mirages in the heat. And then, just like that, they were gone, vanished into thin air. I don't know how long I stood there, rooted to the spot. Felt like hours, though it couldn't have been more than a few minutes. But when I finally gathered the strength to move, I bolted from that room. I didn't care about the rest of the station. I didn't care about anything but getting out. The snowstorm raged on outside, and I felt like I was being swallowed by it. The blizzard, the voices, the shadows, they were all a part of it. I was certain of that. The storm wasn't natural. It was a veil, a barrier between worlds. The storm didn't just hide the researchers. It kept them trapped, stuck between something we couldn't understand. I made it back to the helicopter, my hands shaking as I strapped myself in. The wind howled outside, the sound like the cries of the lost. As the helicopter lifted off, I looked down at the station. It looked so small from the air, so insignificant against the vastness of the frozen land. But I knew better now. The land had swallowed something, and it wasn't going to let it go. When rescue teams finally reached the station a few days later, they found nothing. The equipment had been destroyed. The doors were still open, just like I had left them. But there were no footprints, no traces of the missing team, only the whispers in the wind. I'll never forget that day. No one believes me when I tell them, but I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And sometimes, when the wind picks up in the winter, I still hear that voice, that whisper in the storm, telling me I was lucky to get out. Get out before it gets you too. Story number 7. The HARP Echo. You've heard of HARP, right? Everyone has. It's the high-frequency active auroral research program up there in the farthest reaches of Alaska, well, beyond the places where tourists wander. It's one of those places that seems too secretive for comfort, too hidden from the world. People around here say it's just a weather station. Nothing more. Some of them will even laugh about it. But then there's the other crowd, the ones who think something else is going on. Something darker. Something that never should have been touched. I know the stories. The ones you hear whispered in town. The ones the tourists will chuckle about before shaking their heads. Driving away. And forgetting the place. But if you live here long enough, you stop laughing. You start listening. I used to laugh too. I'm a man who prefers explanations. Rational ones. Things that make sense. I didn't believe in ghosts or shadows at the edges of your vision. But after what happened, after the sounds, the whispers, I'm not so sure anymore. You should know. I've been here my whole life. This town, this region, they're my home. My father worked on the oil rigs up near Prudhoe Bay. And my mother, God rest her soul, used to tell me stories about the old ways, the native legends, the things that go bump in the night. She always said we were guests on this land, that the land had a way of keeping secrets, of protecting itself. I laughed at those stories too, until I heard the hum. It started with a low, constant drone. I thought it was a distant plane at first, maybe one of those military jets. It wasn't unusual to hear them zooming past, although they usually stay farther east. But this hum, it was persistent, and it felt wrong. Like the air itself was vibrating, pulling at the skin on my face, my bones. It wasn't until I woke up that night, feeling as if the ground beneath me had shifted, that I realized just how wrong it was. It was the end of October when it started, the last breath of autumn before the snow came in, thick and heavy, like the earth was exhaling all its sorrow. I remember the way the air tasted, cold, biting, almost metallic. My breath came out in clouds as I stood on the porch, staring out at the horizon. That's when I first heard it. The hum. It seemed to come from the very sky, or maybe from the earth itself. Low, like a growl, almost animalistic. I chalked it up to wind, maybe some odd atmospheric thing that happens when the seasons change. The next day, though, it was still there, and the day after that, I told myself it was nothing. Just my mind playing tricks. Or maybe some old equipment at the base doing whatever strange experiments they were doing up there. You know, weather manipulation. Something to mess with the aurora borealis. HARP's supposed to be all about ionospheric research. But no one really knows what they're actually doing. That's when the stories started coming out of the woodwork. Locals who lived on the outskirts of town, out where the road ends, started talking. They said they'd been hearing strange noises at night, like whispers, static, and sometimes even screaming. They said they felt it in their bones, a pressure building up from nowhere, as if the very air was pushing on them. I didn't believe them, of course. You get that way when you live in Alaska long enough. You learn to ignore the whispers, the cracks in the ground. You get used to the isolation, the wildness. But then things started to happen, and the more I told myself it was nothing, the more it felt like something was happening, something I couldn't explain. It was just before midnight when it happened. I was in bed, drifting in that half-awake, half-dreaming state, when I heard the sound again, the hum. But it was different now, louder, closer. I pulled myself out of bed, fumbling for the flashlight on my dresser. It was so cold in my house that night, colder than usual. I thought about the furnace, about checking the pipes, but there was something about that hum, something that made the hairs on my neck stand up. When I stepped outside, the world was silent, too silent. The snow was falling in thick sheets, but it felt off, like the storm wasn't just a weather event, but something orchestrated, something controlled. And then I saw it. A faint glow in the distance. At first, I thought it was the lights of a car. Or maybe the base HARP's lights are bright at night. But this was different. It was like the lights were shifting, bending in the wind, making strange patterns in the sky. And that's when the hum grew louder. I don't know how long I stood there, transfixed. But then I felt it. The ground beneath my feet shifting, like something was moving beneath it. The snow was crunching around me, but not in the way snow usually does. It was wrong, uneven, unnatural. I could hear a voice, a whisper, low, so low that I couldn't tell if it was in my head or coming from the darkness. Come closer, it said. Come closer, and you'll understand. The next morning, when I woke up, I could still hear the hum in my ears. But when I went outside, everything looked normal. The snow was fresh, undisturbed. No one had seen anything unusual. Nothing had happened. But I knew. I felt it. That hum was still there, lingering just under the surface, waiting for me to listen again. And it wasn't just me. Over the next few weeks, more people started talking. Some would wake up in the middle of the night, unable to sleep, hearing strange whispers coming from the walls. Others reported seeing shadows, shifting figures in the corner of their eyes. I heard from a couple of truck drivers who passed through that the radios in their cabs started malfunctioning every time they drove near the base. Static and garbled voices coming through the airwaves. Voices that didn't belong. It all seemed to point back to HARP, to the sounds, to whatever it was they were doing up there. I decided to visit the base, the place where the hum seemed to originate. It wasn't easy. HARP is a military facility, after all, surrounded by fences and guards. But I knew the locals. I knew how to sneak by, how to get close without being seen. I thought I could find answers. I thought I could hear it all for myself. But when I got close enough, I felt it again, the pressure, the hum, louder this time, only this time. It wasn't just a sound. It was inside me, rattling my bones. I could feel it pulling at my mind, like it was trying to control me. I didn't get close enough to see what was going on inside. Maybe that was a good thing, because when I turned to leave, I saw something in the distance, a figure, standing at the edge of the trees. A man. Or at least I think it was a man. But his face was wrong. Hollow. Sunken. As if it had been burned away. The hum grew louder. I ran. I didn't stop. I haven't been back to the base since then. No one talks about the hum anymore. People have stopped asking about HARP. Stopped whispering about the things that are going on out there in the wild. But I know what I felt. I know what I heard. And I don't think anyone in this town really wants to know the truth about what's really going on in those isolated halls. But if you come to Alaska and you start hearing that hum yourself, you'd better listen. It's not just the weather. It's not just the wind. There's something much darker out there. Something that's been waiting, maybe for years, maybe for centuries. Something that might just be waking up. And it's calling you.